The heat along the Natchez Trace in the summer of 1843 was the kind that made men mean and women restless. Cotton grew thick and white across the rolling hills of Adams County, Mississippi, where the planters lived like kings and the enslaved lived like shadows. The air smelled of magnolia blossoms and sweat, of river water and something darker that nobody wanted to name. Judge Thaddeus Collier owned one of the finest estates along the Trace, a sprawling property called Belmont that sat on 300 acres of prime cotton land. The house rose like a monument to wealth, with white columns that gleamed in the sun and galleries that wrapped around both floors like arms embracing privilege. Inside, crystal chandeliers caught the light from tall windows, and Persian rugs muffled the footsteps of servants who moved like ghosts through rooms filled with mahogany furniture and oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors. The judge was a man of 52, with silver hair swept back from a high forehead and eyes the color of winter ice. Tell me in the comments which country you are from and what you thought of this story. And if this story made an impression on you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future stories. He presided over the county court with an iron gavel and an even harder heart, sentencing runaways to whippings and free blacks to forced indenture on the flimsiest of pretexts. His word was law from Natchez to Vicksburg, and his reputation for cruelty kept both the enslaved and the poor whites in line. But for all his power, Judge Collier could not control what happened when people laid eyes on Samuel. Samuel had come to Belmont 3 years earlier, purchased at auction in New Orleans from a Creole family fallen on hard times. The judge had gone to the city looking for a body servant, someone refined enough to serve wine at dinner parties and drive the carriage without embarrassing him in front of visiting dignitaries. What he found standing on the auction block that humid October morning changed everything. Samuel was 24 years old, and he looked like something out of a painting that wealthy Europeans paid fortunes to commission. His skin was the color of polished bronze, smooth and unmarked despite years of labor. His features seemed impossibly balanced, as if some divine hand had taken extra care in their arrangement. High cheekbones caught the light just so. A strong jaw suggested both strength and gentleness. His nose was perfectly straight, his lips full and expressive. But it was his eyes that truly unsettled people, eyes of an unusual golden brown that seemed to look right through you, seeing things you'd rather keep hidden. He stood 6 feet tall with broad shoulders and the lean, muscular build of a man who had worked hard all his life, but had somehow retained a natural grace that made every movement look deliberate, almost choreographed. His hands were long-fingered and elegant, unsuited to picking cotton, but perfect for handling reins or pouring wine or doing any of the dozen refined tasks that house servants performed. The judge paid $800 for him, nearly twice what a prime field hand would cost, and brought him back to Belmont in chains that seemed almost offensive against such beauty. Within a week, those chains were removed. Within a month, Samuel had learned every preference, every habit, every unspoken rule that governed the judge's household. He drove the carriage with steady hands, served at table without making a sound, and stood in corners during dinner parties like a statue, present but invisible, except that nobody could quite stop looking at him. And that was the problem. Belmont sat at the center of a social universe that revolved around a dozen great families who had ruled Adams County since before Mississippi became a state. The Fairchilds owned the plantation to the north, 5,000 acres, worked by nearly 200 enslaved people. The Rutherfords controlled the land to the south, slightly smaller but equally profitable. The Mortons, the Beaumonts, the Ashworths, the Kincaids, the Danvers, each family occupied its own grand estate along the Trace, and together they formed an aristocracy as rigid and formal as anything in Europe. They visited each other constantly, staging elaborate dinners and balls and hunting parties that reinforced their bonds and reminded everyone else of their dominance. The men talked politics and cotton prices and argued about tariffs and states' rights. The women discussed fashion and servants and marriages, always marriages, because in that world, matrimony was both romance and business transaction, a way to consolidate wealth and produce heirs who would inherit empires built on human misery. Into this carefully ordered world, Samuel arrived like a stone thrown into still water, and the ripples spread in every direction. It started innocently enough. Mrs. Eleanor Fairchild came calling on a Tuesday afternoon in late April, ostensibly to borrow a particular shade of silk thread that she needed to finish a needlepoint project. She was 38 years old, married for 20 years to Colonel Harrison Fairchild, and considered one of the great beauties of the county in her youth, though age and 4 children had softened her figure and added lines around her eyes. She wore a pale yellow dress with enormous sleeves and a bonnet decorated with artificial flowers, and she sat in the collier parlour making polite conversation with the judge's wife, Martha, while Samuel stood near the door, waiting to bring more tea if requested. Eleanor could not stop glancing at him. Stop. Her eyes kept drifting across the room, taking in his perfect posture, the way the afternoon light from the window illuminated his profile, the almost regal bearing that seemed so at odds with his status. She fumbled her teacup twice, nearly spilling it, and when Samuel moved forward to take it from her trembling hands, their fingers touched for just an instant. That night, Eleanor lay awake in her bed while her husband snored beside her, and she thought about golden eyes and bronze skin and the shocking electricity that had run through her body at that momentary contact. She told herself it meant nothing. She told herself it was merely curiosity, the same fascination one might feel seeing an unusually beautiful horse or a perfectly shaped flower. She told herself many things, but she could not stop thinking about him. She returned to Bellamont 3 days later, this time claiming she needed advice on planning a garden party. Then, a week after that, bringing a recipe for preserves that she thought Martha might enjoy. Each time, Samuel was there, silent and attentive, and each time Eleanor felt something inside her shift and crack like ice breaking on the river in spring. If Eleanor Fairchild had been the only one, perhaps nothing would have happened, but she was not alone. Mrs. Catherine Rutherford, who had married for money rather than love, and spent 15 years in a cold union with a man who preferred the company of his hunting dogs, began inventing reasons to visit Bellamont almost weekly. Mrs. Abigail Morton, young and newly married to a husband 40 years her senior, developed a sudden interest in Martha Collier's opinions on everything from flower arrangements to Bible verses. Mrs. Louisa Beaumont, Mrs. Sarah Ashworth, even Mrs. Harriet Kincaid, whose husband was a deacon in the Baptist church and who had never shown interest in anything beyond prayer meetings and quilting circles. All of them found excuses to call at Bellamont, to sit in that parlour, to occupy the same space as Samuel and feel the unsettling pull of his presence. The enslaved people at Bellamont noticed first, of course. They always noticed. In the quarters behind the big house, where 50 souls lived in rough-hewn cabins and cooked their meagre rations over open fires, the whispering began almost immediately. "That's Samuel, he got something on him," old Mama Ruth said one evening while stirring a pot of beans. She was nearly 70, bent with age and hard labour, but her mind was sharp as ever. "Something that don't belong in this world. Mark my words, that boy gonna bring trouble down on all our heads." "He don't do nothing," protested Dinah, a young woman who worked in the Collier kitchen. "Just stands there quiet like, doing what he's told." "That's just it," Mama Ruth said, tapping the wooden spoon against the pot. "Don't have to do nothing. That kind of beauty, it's like a weapon. And these white folks, they don't know what to do with it except destroy themselves trying to possess it." In the big house, Martha Collier noticed too, though at first she dismissed it as harmless socializing among bored plantation mistresses with too much time and too little purpose. But as the visits increased in frequency, As she saw the flush that came to these women's cheeks when Samuel entered the room, as she caught the lingering looks and the slight tremor in voices when they addressed him, Martha began to feel something she had not experienced in years, a cold, creeping jealousy. She was 46 years old, married to the judge for 28 years, mother to 3 children now grown and managing their own households. She had been beautiful once, before childbirth and time and the peculiar loneliness of being married to a man incapable of tenderness had worn away her youth. She looked at these younger women circling her house like moths around a flame, and she hated them. But more than that, she hated Samuel for inspiring such foolishness, for being the catalyst that exposed the hollowness at the center of their seemingly perfect lives. Judge Collier noticed none of this. He was pleased that his household had become so popular, that the wives of his fellow planters sought out his wife's company so regularly. It confirmed his status, reinforced his position at the top of the county's social hierarchy. He saw Samuel as a successful investment, a servant who reflected well on his taste and his wealth, nothing more. But others were beginning to notice, and their observations were far less benign. Colonel Harrison Fairchild returned home early one Thursday afternoon from a meeting in Natchez and found his wife Eleanor standing before her dressing mirror, adjusting her hair for the 3rd time, preparing for yet another visit to Belmont. Something in her expression, a kind of eager anticipation he had not seen, directed at him in years, made him pause. "You seem quite devoted to Martha Collier lately," he said carefully, leaning against the doorframe of their bedroom. Eleanor's hands froze for just a moment before continuing to adjust a curl. "She's been a good friend. I enjoy her company." "You never enjoyed it quite so much before." "Perhaps I'm simply making more effort to maintain friendships," Eleanor said, her voice tight. "Is there something wrong with that?" Harrison said nothing more, but he stood there watching his wife with narrowed eyes, and in his chest a small seed of suspicion began to take root. At the Rutherford plantation, Catherine's husband Thomas noticed that his wife had begun wearing perfume again, something she had not done in years. At the Morton estate, Abigail's elderly husband wondered aloud why his young wife suddenly cared so much about the social affairs of women twice her age. The men talked among themselves at their clubs and hunting lodges, making jokes about how devoted their wives had become to the Collier household, laughing nervously at observations that contained more truth than they wanted to acknowledge. But underneath the laughter ran an undercurrent of unease, the instinctive recognition that something was shifting in the careful balance of their world. Samuel himself said nothing. He performed his duties with quiet efficiency, his face revealing nothing of whatever thoughts moved behind those extraordinary eyes. When the women spoke to him, he answered in monosyllables. "Yes, ma'am." "No, ma'am." "Right away, ma'am." His voice a low, musical baritone that seemed to resonate in the chest like the lowest notes of a cello. He never initiated conversation. He never met anyone's eyes for more than a moment. He moved through the house like water, finding the path of least resistance, making himself useful and invisible at the same time. But invisibility was impossible for someone who looked like Samuel. Every entrance into a room caused a subtle shift in energy, as if the air itself had to make space for such concentrated beauty. The harder he tried to fade into the background, the more people noticed him, and the more they noticed him, the more they began to wonder what thoughts lived behind that carefully maintained mask of servility. June arrived with oppressive heat that seemed to press down on the county like a physical weight. The cotton grew tall in the fields, and the enslaved people worked from dawn to dusk under a merciless sun, while their masters retreated to shaded galleries and parlors, fanning themselves and complaining about the weather. The Natchez Trace shimmered with heat mirages, and the Mississippi River ran low and sluggish, revealing muddy banks studded with driftwood. It was during this sultry season that everything began to unravel. though the first threads pulled loose so quietly that nobody realized what was happening until the entire fabric had torn beyond repair. On the Wednesday evening in mid-June, Judge Collier hosted a dinner party for 6 couples. The cream of Adams County society gathered around his mahogany table, eating roasted duck and drinking French wine, while Samuel and 2 other house servants moved silently around the room, refilling glasses and replacing dishes. The conversation flowed easily through topics both trivial and significant: the prospects for the cotton crop, the latest news from Washington, the scandal of a merchant in Natchez who had been caught selling liquor to enslaved people. Eleanor Fairchild sat directly across from where Samuel stood against the wall, waiting to serve the next course. Throughout the meal, her eyes kept drifting to him, watching the way candlelight played across his features, creating shadows and highlights that made him look like something painted by an old master. She barely touched her food. When her husband asked her a direct question about their daughter's upcoming visit, she startled as if waking from sleep and answered so vaguely that several people exchanged glances. Catherine Rutherford, seated 3 places down, was no better. She knocked over her wineglass when Samuel leaned forward to refill it, the red liquid spreading across the white tablecloth like blood. In the confusion of servants rushing to clean up the mess, Samuel's hand briefly touched Catherine's shoulder to steady her, and she inhaled sharply, her whole body going rigid at the contact. Thomas Rutherford saw his wife's reaction. Harrison Fairchild saw his wife's wandering attention. And across the table, Charles Morton noticed his young wife Abigail staring at the handsome slave with an expression that could only be described as longing. The dinner ended early, the guests departing with stiff goodbyes and forced smiles, and in 3 separate carriages rolling home through the darkness, 3 separate arguments began, each following the same pattern. Accusations met with denials, suspicions voiced and rejected, marriages cracking under the weight of unspoken truths. The storm was coming. Samuel could feel it the way animals sense approaching weather, some instinct warning him that forces beyond his control were converging, that his carefully maintained invisibility was about to shatter, and when it did, blood would follow. He was right, but even he could not have imagined how completely the world was about to burn. The morning after the disastrous dinner party, Samuel woke before dawn in the small room he occupied off the back of the Collier house, a space barely large enough for a narrow bed and a wooden chest. He dressed in the dark, pulling on the fine clothes that Judge Collier required him to wear: black trousers, a white shirt, a vest of dark grey, and made his way quietly through the sleeping house to begin his morning duties. He started fires in the kitchen, helped the cook prepare breakfast, and carried water from the well behind the house. By the time the sun rose over the cotton fields, turning the eastern sky pink and gold, Samuel was polishing the judge's boots in the mudroom, his hands moving with practiced efficiency while his mind wandered to dangerous places. He had learned long ago not to hope for anything. Hope was a luxury that enslaved people could not afford, a weight that dragged you down when survival required you to float above emotion, to exist in a state of careful neutrality that protected your spirit from the constant assaults of bondage. But lately, Samuel had found himself thinking about freedom with increasing frequency, turning the idea over in his mind like a coin that might purchase something valuable if only he could figure out where to spend it. He knew about the Underground Railroad, whispered stories passed among the enslaved about routes north to freedom, about conductors and safe houses and the promised land of Canada where a black man could walk as free as any white. He knew about runaways who made it and about those who were caught and brought back to face punishments that made death seem merciful. He knew the odds, and they were not good. But he also knew that staying at Bellamont was becoming increasingly dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with the judge's temper or overseer's whip. The attention of those plantation mistresses was like a noose slowly tightening around his neck, and Samuel had lived long enough to understand that when white women became obsessed with a black man, the outcome was always the same. The man died one way or another, whether by lynching or poisoning or being sold away to a place where slow death from overwork was guaranteed. "You thinking too loud." Samuel looked up to find Dinah standing in the doorway, a basket of eggs balanced on her hip. She was 19, dark-skinned and pretty, in a way that had attracted too much unwanted attention from the overseer, though she had so far managed to deflect his advances through a combination of cleverness and having Mama Ruth's protection. She looked at Samuel with a mixture of sympathy and exasperation. "You gonna get yourself killed," she said quietly, glancing over her shoulder to make sure they were alone. "All these white ladies coming around, their husbands starting to notice. Already talk in the quarters that something bad is coming." "I don't encourage them," Samuel said, setting down the boot and the polishing cloth. "Don't matter if you encourage them or not. You breathe, and they lose their minds." Dinah shook her head. "That face of yours, it's a curse. Mama Ruth says you got the mark on you, that trouble follows beauty, like flies follow honey." "What am I supposed to do? Ask the judge to sell me somewhere else?" Samuel's voice was bitter. "Where would be better? Another plantation where the same thing happens? A cotton field where I work myself to death by 30? There's no good choice." "There's north," Dinah said, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. "Jacob's cousin made it to Ohio last year, sent word back through the grapevine. Said there's people who help, white people who hate slavery, who guide folks north to freedom." Samuel had heard these stories too, but they seemed like fairy tales, narratives of escape that were too good to be true. For every story of successful flight, there were 10 stories of captured runaways returned in chains, their backs torn open by whips, or worse. The Fugitive Slave Act meant that even reaching the north did not guarantee safety. Bounty hunters prowled free states, capturing black people and dragging them back south, sometimes kidnapping free-born black people and selling them into slavery with forged papers. "Even if I tried," Samuel said, "the judge watches me close. I drive him places, I serve at his table, I'm in the house all day where people can see me. How would I even get away without being noticed immediately?" Before Dinah could answer, they heard footsteps approaching, and she quickly moved away, carrying her eggs toward the kitchen. Samuel returned to polishing boots, and when Martha Collier appeared moments later to inspect the morning's work, his face showed nothing but attentive civility. But inside, his mind continued to turn over possibilities, looking for an opening that did not yet exist. That afternoon, Eleanor Fairchild arrived at Bellamont unannounced, her carriage clattering up the long drive, lined with oak trees draped in Spanish moss. She looked disheveled, her hair not quite properly arranged beneath her bonnet, her dress wrinkled as if she had put it on in haste. Martha Collier received her in the parlour with barely concealed irritation. "Eleanor, this is unexpected. I wasn't aware we had plans today." "We don't," Eleanor said, sitting down without waiting for an invitation. "I needed to speak with you about something important. Is Samuel available? I wanted to ask him about the horses. Harrison mentioned looking into purchasing a new carriage horse, and I thought Samuel might have recommendations since he drives for the judge." It was a transparent excuse, so obviously false that Martha's expression hardened into something dangerous. She sat down slowly in the chair across from Eleanor, folding her hands in her lap with deliberate precision. "Samuel is a slave, Eleanor. He knows what he's told to know and does what he's told to do. He's not a horse trader." "Of course not. I just thought—" "What I think," Martha interrupted, her voice cold, "is that you've been coming here quite often lately, and I've begun to wonder about your true purpose. Are you seeking my friendship, Eleanor? Or are you seeking something else?" Eleanor's face flushed red. "I don't know what you're implying." "I think you do." Martha leaned forward slightly, her eyes hard. "I've watched you and Catherine and Abigail and all the others circling my house like vultures. You come here making excuses, finding reasons to be in rooms where Samuel is present, looking at him like he's a piece of art you want to purchase. Do you think I'm blind? Do you think I don't see what's happening?" "Nothing is happening," Eleanor said, but her voice shook. You're imagining things. Am I? Martha stood up, her voice rising. You barely speak to me during these visits. Your eyes follow him around the room. You invent the flimsiest excuses to be here. What exactly do you think will come of this obsession? Do you imagine he returns your interest? He's property, Eleanor. He has no more say in his life than one of your husband's horses. Whatever romantic fantasy you've constructed in your mind, it's a delusion. Eleanor stood as well, her face now pale, her hands trembling. How dare you speak to me this way? I came here in friendship. You came here to feed an unseemly fixation, and I'm telling you it needs to stop. You're embarrassing yourself, embarrassing your husband, and putting Samuel in danger. Do you understand that? Every time you look at him the way you do, you make it more likely that someone will decide he's a threat that needs to be eliminated. Is that what you want? To get him killed? The words hung in the air between them, like a physical presence. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, and she grabbed her bag and rushed toward the door, nearly colliding with Samuel, who was entering the room carrying a tray with tea service. She stopped, frozen, staring at him for a long moment, her face a mask of confused emotion. Then she pushed past him and out the front door, her departure marked by the sound of her carriage wheels on gravel moments later. Samuel set the tea tray down carefully, his face revealing nothing. Martha stood looking at him, and for the first time he met her eyes directly. They regarded each other in silence for a long moment. Two people trapped in roles neither had chosen, both aware of forces moving around them that could not be controlled. This is going to end badly, Martha said quietly. You know that, don't you? Yes, ma'am, Samuel replied, his voice steady. And yet you do nothing to discourage them. I do everything to discourage them, Mum. I don't speak unless spoken to. I don't meet their eyes. I make myself as invisible as possible. But it doesn't seem to matter. Martha nodded slowly. She was not a cruel woman. Not really, just a woman who had learned that survival in her world required a certain hardness, a willingness to accept terrible injustices as natural and necessary. But standing there looking at Samuel, she felt something crack inside her, some small recognition of the fundamental wrongness of a system that had created this situation. My husband paid $800 for you, she said. That's a considerable investment. He values you highly, which means he won't sell you easily. But if these women continue their foolishness, if their husbands become convinced that you're encouraging their wives' attention, they'll force his hand. They'll demand that you be sold away, or worse. And when powerful men demand something, even a judge has limited ability to refuse. I understand, ma'am. Do you? Martha moved closer to him, lowering her voice. I don't think you do. I don't think you understand how quickly this can turn violent. These men, they own everything and everyone around them. They're not accustomed to feeling threatened, and a slave who makes their wives act foolishly, that's a threat. They'll kill you, Samuel. They'll find a reason, manufacture a crime, and they'll hang you from a tree as a lesson to everyone else. And nobody will stop them, because this is Mississippi, and you're black, and they're white, and that's all that matters. Samuel said nothing. What was there to say? Everything she had told him he already knew. He had known it his entire life, the fundamental precariousness of his existence, the knowledge that his life could end at any moment, for any reason or no reason at all, that justice and mercy were concepts that applied to white people, not to him. Martha sighed and moved back to her chair. Pour the tea, please. Then you're dismissed for the afternoon. Stay in the quarters with the others. I don't want any unexpected visitors finding you here. Samuel poured tea with steady hands, set the cup on the small table beside her chair, and left the room. As he walked through the house toward the back door that led to the quarters, he felt the walls closing in, the space for movement becoming smaller and smaller. Dinah was right. Something was coming, and when it arrived, it would be violent and final. He needed to leave Belmont. The only question was how and whether he could manage it before the storm broke. In the quarters that evening, while the enslaved people ate their simple supper of cornbread and beans, the talk was all of the white ladies and the trouble they were bringing. Mama Ruth sat near the fire, smoking her clay pipe, her old eyes shrewd. "Seen this before," she said to the assembled group. "Down in Louisiana, must be 30 years back. Pretty young buck named Joseph, looked like an angel carved from ebony. All the white ladies took notice, started finding excuses to be around him. Ended with Joseph hanging from an oak tree, his body cut to pieces, and 3 families leaving the parish in disgrace. White folks called it justice. We knew it was just what happens when black beauty reminds white folks of all their own ugliness." "Samuel ain't done nothing wrong," Dinah protested. "Don't matter," Mama Ruth said. "Wrong and right don't apply when white folks feel their world slipping. They're gonna blame him for their wives' wandering hearts, gonna punish him for the sin of being beautiful. That's how it works. That's how it always works." Samuel sat slightly apart from the others, eating mechanically, listening to predictions of his doom, delivered in matter-of-fact tones. These people cared about him in their way, but they were also practical. They had learned that caring too much about someone in danger just meant more grief when the inevitable occurred. Better to maintain some distance, to acknowledge the coming tragedy without being destroyed by it. After supper, an old man named Isaac approached Samuel. Isaac had been at Bellamont longer than anyone else, had seen overseers come and go, had survived more punishments and hardships than most people could imagine. He was somewhere past 60, his hair white, his body bent from decades of labor, but his mind remained sharp. "Walk with me," Isaac said quietly. They moved away from the fire, out into the darkness beyond the quarters where they could speak without being overheard. The night was thick with humidity, the air full of insect sounds and the distant barking of dogs. Fireflies drifted through the darkness like tiny lanterns. "You thinking about running?" Isaac said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Samuel admitted. No point in lying to a man who had probably forgotten more about survival than Samuel would ever learn. "Good. You should. Stay here. You're dead before harvest." Isaac was silent for a moment, then continued. "I got information that might help. My daughter, she was sold to a plantation over in Louisiana years back, but I still get word sometimes through people traveling. Last message I got, maybe 2 months ago, said there's a place near Natchez called Devil's Punch Bowl, old eroded ravine full of caves and thick forest. Runaways hide there sometimes, and there's a white man, a Quaker, who lives on a farm nearby. Name of Josiah Henderson. He helps people get north, part of the railroad they talk about." Samuel's heart began to beat faster. "How do you know this is true? Could be a trap." "Could be," Isaac agreed. "But I trust the people who sent word. They got no reason to lie, and I know them from way back. This Henderson, he's been helping folks for years, never been caught, careful as can be. If you can get to him, he might be able to get you north." "The Devil's Punch Bowl," Samuel repeated, committing the name to memory. "How far from here?" "Maybe 8, 10 miles south, close to Natchez. You'd have to go on foot, stay off the main roads, travel at night. It's dangerous, and if they catch you—" Isaac didn't need to finish the sentence. They both knew what happened to captured runaways. "Why are you telling me this?" Samuel asked. "If I run and they find out you knew, they'll punish you." Isaac shrugged. "I'm old. I've been beaten so many times I barely feel it anymore. But you still got a chance at life, real life. Seems a shame to waste that just to keep some white lady's secrets. You run, Samuel. Run hard and don't look back. Maybe you make it, maybe you don't, but at least you tried. That's worth something." They stood in silence for a moment, these 2 men who had been reduced to property, but who still maintained some core of dignity that slavery could not quite destroy. Then Isaac clasped Samuel's shoulder briefly and walked back toward the quarters, leaving Samuel alone in the darkness to contemplate an impossible choice between certain death and probable death. The moon rose over the cotton fields, bright and full, illuminating the landscape in shades of silver and shadow. Samuel looked toward the big house, then south toward Natchez and the Devil's Punch Bowl, then north toward the distant promise of freedom that might be real or might be just another cruel illusion. He had perhaps a week, he estimated, before the situation became untenable. The white men were growing suspicious. The white women were growing careless. Something would break soon, and when it did, Samuel needed to be gone. He began to plan. 3 days after his conversation with Isaac, Samuel was driving Judge Collier into Natchez for a session of the county court. They left Belmont just after dawn, the judge reading through legal papers in the back of the carriage, while Samuel guided the horses along the Natchez trace, his mind working through the details of escape while his hands held the reins with practiced ease. Natchez perched on high bluffs overlooking the Mississippi River, a city of contradictions where immense wealth from cotton and slavery coexisted with poverty and vice. The upper part of town featured grand mansions and respectable businesses, churches with tall steeples and banks with marble columns, but down near the river lay Natchez under the hill, a notorious district of taverns and gambling houses and brothels where boatmen and criminals conducted business away from polite society's eyes. The courthouse stood in the center of the upper town, a Greek revival building that proclaimed the majesty of law to anyone who approached. Samuel brought the carriage to a stop at the front steps, climbed down to open the door for the judge, and then drove the carriage to a nearby stable where he would wait for several hours until court adjourned. The stable was run by a free black man named Moses Tucker, who had purchased his own freedom 15 years earlier, and through hard work and careful saving had managed to build a small business that catered to the carriages of wealthy whites who came to town for business. Moses was in his 50s, gray-haired and cautious, a man who had learned to navigate the dangerous waters of freedom in a slave state by being useful without being threatening. He nodded to Samuel as the carriage rolled into the stable yard. "Judge Collier in court today?" "Yes, sir. Likely to be several hours. You can wait in the tack room if you want. Got coffee brewing." Moses gestured toward a small building attached to the stable. Samuel secured the horses and followed Moses into the tack room, where the smell of leather and horse liniment mixed with the aroma of coffee boiling in a pot over a small stove. 2 other black men were already there, drivers for other white families, and they nodded greeting to Samuel before returning to their conversation about a horse race planned for the following week. Samuel poured coffee into a tin cup and sat on a wooden bench, listening to the casual talk, waiting for an opportunity. After about 20 minutes, one of the other drivers left to check on his horses, and the second man dozed off in a corner. Moses busied himself mending a harness, and Samuel moved closer to him. "Can I ask you something?" Samuel kept his voice low. Moses glanced up, his hands not stopping their work. "You can ask. Whether I answer is a different matter. I've heard stories about people finding their way north, about the railroad." Moses's hands stopped moving. He looked at Samuel with an expression that mixed sympathy and wariness. "That's dangerous talk, boy. Dangerous for you, dangerous for me, dangerous for anyone who hears it. I know, but I need to know if the stories are true, if there really are people who help." Moses set down the harness and leather needle, studying Samuel's face. "You in trouble at Belmont?" "Not yet, but it's coming. There's a situation with some white ladies, and their husbands are starting to notice. I don't think I have much time." Moses nodded slowly. He had seen this story before, understood immediately the particular danger that Samuel faced. "Even if the railroad exists, and even if I knew anything about it, which I'm not saying I do, running is risky. You know the odds. Most runaways get caught within a few days, brought back, punished publicly as a lesson to others. You got any skills that would help you survive on the run?" "I can read and write," Samuel said. "I can handle horses, drive a carriage, do fine carpentry. The judge's son taught me numbers when I was younger." Moses raised his eyebrows. "That's more than most, but it also makes you valuable, which means they'll look harder if you run. Judge Collier will put out notices, offer rewards. Every patroller and bounty hunter in Mississippi will be watching for you. I know, but staying means dying. At least running gives me a chance. Moses was quiet for a long moment, wrestling with the decision of whether to help. If he aided a runaway and was discovered, he could lose everything. His freedom, his business, possibly his life. Free black people lived always on the edge of disaster in the South, their status precarious and dependent on white goodwill that could evaporate in an instant. But Moses remembered being enslaved, remembered the desperation that came from being property, and looking at Samuel, he saw a young man who deserved better than the fate Mississippi had planned for him. "There's a place called Devil's Punch Bowl," Moses said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "South of here, maybe a mile past the edge of town. It's an eroded ravine, steep walls, dense forest, caves. Sometimes runaways hide there for a few days before moving on. And there's a man, a white man, lives on a small farm near there, Josiah Henderson. He's a Quaker, and Quakers don't believe in slavery. Word is he helps people get north, though I never met anyone who can say for sure. How would I find him? If you could get to the punch bowl, stay hidden for a day or so. Henderson sometimes comes through, checking for people who need help. But it's a risk. Could be patrollers stake it out, knowing runaways hide there. Could be Henderson is a trap, though I don't believe that. Could be you just get lost in the forest and starve. Nothing about this is safe. Nothing about staying is safe either," Samuel said. Moses picked up his harness again, his signal that the conversation was over. "I never saw you today. We never talked. If anyone asks, you sat quiet in the corner and didn't speak to nobody. Understand?" "Yes, sir. Thank you." Moses nodded without looking up. "May God watch over you, boy. You're gonna need all the help you can get." Samuel returned to his bench and sat drinking coffee, his mind racing through calculations. He needed to gather supplies without being noticed, food that wouldn't spoil, a water container, matches, maybe a knife if he could find one. He needed to choose a night when he wouldn't be missed until morning, giving him maximum time to get distance from Bellamont. He needed to study the route to Natchez in his mind, plan a path that avoided main roads and the farms where dogs would alert to his passing. When the judge emerged from court hours later, Samuel drove him home with his usual quiet competence, and that evening he served dinner as if nothing had changed. But inside, the countdown had begun. He had perhaps 4 or 5 days before the situation exploded. He needed to be ready to move when the moment came. That night, trouble arrived in a form he had not anticipated. Thomas Rutherford came calling on Judge Collier around 8 o'clock, well past the usual time for social visits. Samuel answered the door and showed him into the judge's study, where Collier sat reading legal documents by lamplight. Samuel withdrew to the hallway, but the study door was slightly ajar, and voices carried clearly in the quiet house. "I need to speak with you about a delicate matter," Rutherford said without preamble. "Of course, Thomas. Sit down. Would you like brandy?" "No, thank you. This isn't a social call." Rutherford's voice was tight with anger. "It concerns your man, Samuel." Samuel's blood went cold. He stood frozen in the hallway listening. "What about him?" The judge's tone was guarded. "My wife has been behaving strangely for weeks now. Visiting your household constantly, making flimsy excuses, acting like a schoolgirl with a crush. Tonight I confronted her about it, and she admitted that she's been coming here primarily to see Samuel. She claims nothing improper has occurred, but I don't believe her. And even if it's true, the mere fact that my wife is obsessed with your slave is intolerable." There was a long silence. Then the judge spoke, his voice cold. "What exactly are you suggesting happened, Thomas?" "I'm suggesting that your man has been encouraging my wife's attention, perhaps through looks or words or some other means. Catherine is not a fool. She would not develop such an attachment unless there was some reciprocation. Samuel is property. He does what he's told and nothing more. If your wife has developed an inappropriate fixation, that's a failing of her character, not evidence of any action on his part." Rutherford's voice rose. "Are you calling my wife a liar?" I'm saying that Samuel has neither the will nor the ability to encourage anyone's attention. He stands in corners and serves food and drives carriages. If Mrs. Rutherford finds that appealing, perhaps you should examine the state of your marriage rather than blaming a slave who has no choice in his circumstances. This is exactly the attitude I expected from you, Rutherford said bitterly. You value that man too highly. You parade him around like a trophy, showing off your good taste in acquiring such a refined servant. But you're blind to the disruption he's causing. It's not just Catherine. Eleanor Fairchild is obsessed with him. So is Abigail Morton. So are half a dozen other women in the county. They're making fools of themselves and of their husbands, and it all traces back to your slave. So you want me to do what exactly? Sell him? Send him to the cotton fields? Have him scarred so he's less attractive? The judge's voice dripped with sarcasm. I want him gone, sold to a plantation so far from here that our wives will never see him again. Or better yet, to one of the sugar plantations in Louisiana, where slaves work themselves to death in a few years. Problem solved. Life returns to normal. Samuel represents a significant investment. I paid $800 for him 3 years ago. He's worth more now, given his training and abilities. I'm not selling him to satisfy your inability to control your own household. Then I'll take this to the others, Rutherford said, standing up. Samuel heard the scrape of a chair on the wooden floor. Harrison Fairchild feels the same way I do. So does Charles Morton. We'll make this a public issue. Force your hand through social pressure if necessary. One way or another, that slave is leaving your property, and if you refuse to sell him, we'll find another solution. Is that a threat, Thomas? It's a promise. Good evening, Judge. Rutherford stormed out of the study and past Samuel in the hallway without acknowledging him, slamming the front door hard enough to rattle the windows. Samuel stood motionless, his heart pounding, knowing that everything had just accelerated. The white men had formed a consensus. They were going to force the issue, and whether that meant sale or murder or something in between, the outcome would be the same. Samuel's time at Bellamont was over, and his time alive was rapidly running out. He returned to the quarters that night and sought out Isaac, pulling him aside to speak privately. It's happening faster than I thought. I need to go soon, maybe tomorrow night. Isaac nodded. What do you need? Food that I can carry, a container for water, maybe a knife if you can find one without it being missed, and I need someone to cover for me in the morning, make excuses when I don't appear for duties. That last one is dangerous. They'll know someone helped. I know, I'm sorry, but without a few hours' head start, I won't make it to the punch bowl. Isaac thought for a moment, then nodded. I'll do it. I'll tell them you took sick in the night, that I saw you heading into the woods to relieve yourself and figured you had stomach troubles. That might buy you until mid-morning before they really start searching. After that, he shrugged. After that, I'm either free or I'm not, Samuel finished. Thank you, Isaac, for everything. Don't thank me yet. Thank me when you're in Canada, if you ever get there. Isaac clasped Samuel's hand. Go with God, son. May he watch over you and guide your steps. Samuel spent the next day in a state of heightened awareness, memorizing every detail of the house and grounds, taking note of when guards changed position, when dogs were most alert, when traffic along the Natchez trace was lightest. He served dinner that evening with steady hands, and when the judge mentioned casually that several gentlemen would be calling tomorrow to discuss a matter of mutual concern, Samuel knew his timeline had just collapsed. They were going to force the judge to sell him, or worse, they were going to take matters into their own hands. He had to leave tonight. After the household went to sleep, Samuel lay on his narrow bed fully clothed, waiting for midnight. Isaac had left a small bundle outside his door, cornbread, dried meat, a gourd for water, and a small knife used for cutting rope. It wasn't much, but it would have to be enough. At midnight, when the house had been silent for over an hour, Samuel rose and slipped out through the back door, moving like a shadow across the yard toward the edge of the cotton fields. The moon was 3/4 full, providing enough light to navigate, but also making him more visible to anyone watching. He moved quickly but carefully, staying low, using every patch of shadow for cover. Behind him, Belmont stood like a white monument to everything cruel and beautiful in the South, a house built on suffering and maintained by violence, a place where he had existed for 3 years, in a kind of beautiful captivity that was about to cost him his life if he didn't move fast enough. He reached the edge of the cotton fields and paused, looking back one last time. Somewhere in that house, Martha Collier slept, and the judge and the other servants who would wake tomorrow to find him gone. He felt a pang of guilt for the trouble his escape would bring them, but it was a small guilt compared to the overwhelming necessity of flight. Samuel turned south and began to run, heading toward Natchez, toward the Devil's Punch Bowl, toward a white man he had never met, who might help him or might turn him in for the reward. Behind him, the dogs began to bark. The barking sent ice through Samuel's veins, but he forced himself not to panic. He was already 200 yards from the quarters, and the dogs were still chained near the slave cabins. They were reacting to his movement, but they couldn't pursue yet. He had time, but not much. Samuel ran through the cotton fields, the plants reaching waist-high and rustling as he passed, the dry stalks catching on his clothes. The moon above painted everything in silver and black, turning the landscape into something alien and dreamlike. His breath came hard and fast, his heart hammering against his ribs, but his legs were strong from years of physical labor, and he pushed himself into a steady pace that he could maintain for miles. Behind him, he heard shouting. Someone had woken, probably the overseer or one of the patrollers who regularly checked the grounds. More dogs began barking, and Samuel knew the hunt would begin in earnest within minutes. They would organize quickly, releasing the hounds, gathering men on horseback, sending riders to alert other plantations. The network of surveillance that kept enslaved people trapped would activate like a trap springing shut. He reached the edge of the Collier property and crossed into forest, grateful for the cover of trees, even though the undergrowth made running more difficult. Branches whipped at his face and arms, roots threatened to trip him, and the darkness under the canopy was nearly absolute. But he knew this area reasonably well from occasional trips to Natchez with the judge, and he had a mental map of the general direction he needed to travel, south and slightly west, toward Natchez, toward the Devil's Punch Bowl, toward an uncertain future that was still better than the certain death he had left behind. The forest was alive with night sounds. Owls calling, small animals rustling through leaves, insects singing their endless songs. Samuel tried to move quietly, but speed was more important than stealth now. Every minute of distance he could put between himself and Belmont increased his chances of survival. After what he estimated was an hour of running and walking, he reached a small creek and followed it downstream for perhaps half a mile, wading in the shallow water to throw the dogs off his scent. The water was cool against his legs, and he paused long enough to drink deeply from the gourd Isaac had provided, then filled it again before emerging on the opposite bank. He could hear dogs in the distance now, their baying carrying through the night air. They had picked up his trail and were following, though he couldn't tell how far behind they were. A mile? 2 miles? Distance was difficult to judge by sound alone, especially when fear made every noise seem closer than it was. Samuel pushed on, his clothes wet from the creek, his legs beginning to tire. He had been running or walking fast for nearly 2 hours now, covering maybe 6 or 7 miles if his estimation was accurate. He needed to reach the Devil's Punch Bowl before dawn, before the full machinery of capture could be organized and deployed. The forest began to thin, and Samuel found himself at the edge of cleared farmland. He skirted around it, staying in the tree line, unwilling to risk being silhouetted against open fields. A farmhouse stood in the distance, dark except for a single light in an upstairs window. Dogs barked as he passed, but they were chained, and he moved quickly enough to avoid waking anyone inside. More farms, more careful navigation around cleared land, more precious minutes ticking away. The eastern sky was beginning to lighten with the faint grey that preceded dawn when Samuel finally spotted what could only be the Devil's Punch Bowl. It was aptly named. The land dropped away into a massive erosion feature, a bowl-shaped depression perhaps a quarter-mile across and 200 feet deep at its center. The sides were near vertical in places, carved by centuries of water and wind into a landscape that looked alien and forbidding. Dense forest covered the slopes, and Samuel could see the dark openings of caves scattered across the eroded walls. This was a place of rumor and superstition among both black and white people. Locals claimed it was haunted, that strange lights appeared in the ravine at night, that people who ventured too deep never came out. Some said it had been a sacred place to the Natchez Indians who once inhabited the region, and that their ghosts still lingered. Others claimed the devil himself had created it with a blow from his fist, and that the caves led down to hell itself. Samuel didn't believe in such stories, but standing at the edge of the punch bowl as dawn approached, he understood why people told them. The place had an unsettling quality, a sense of wrongness that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. But it also offered exactly what he needed, a place to hide where pursuers would be reluctant to follow. He began picking his way down the steep slope, grabbing onto trees and roots to keep from sliding. The earth was loose and unstable, and more than once he lost his footing and slid several feet before catching himself. By the time he reached the bottom of the ravine, his hands were scraped raw, and his clothes were covered in red Mississippi clay. A small stream ran through the bottom of the punch bowl, and Samuel followed it deeper into the ravine, looking for one of the caves he had seen from above. He found a suitable opening about 20 feet up the eastern wall, just large enough for a man to squeeze through. He climbed up to it, finding handholds in the eroded rock, and pulled himself inside. The cave was larger than it appeared from outside, extending back into darkness for at least 15 feet. The floor was dry, covered in leaves and debris that had blown in over time. It smelled of earth and rock and something ancient, but it was shelter, and it was hidden. Samuel moved to the back of the cave and sat down, his back against the stone wall, his breath finally slowing. His whole body ached, his legs trembled from hours of flight, and his throat was raw from exertion. But he was alive, and he was hidden, and for the moment, that was enough. He ate some of the cornbread and dried meat that Isaac had provided, washing it down with water from the gourd. Then he sat in the darkness, listening to the sound of his own breathing and the distant call of birds greeting the dawn. He allowed himself to sleep for a few hours, trusting that anyone searching for him would start closer to Bellamont and work outward. When he woke, the sun was higher in the sky, though little light penetrated to the bottom of the punch bowl. He moved to the mouth of the cave and looked out at the strange landscape. The ravine was eerily quiet. No birds sang here. No animals moved through the undergrowth. Samuel wondered if the superstitions about the place had some basis in reality, if there was something about the geography or the quality of the air that made creatures avoid it. He spent the day in a state of anxious watchfulness, occasionally hearing distant sounds that might have been pursuit, men calling to each other, dogs barking, the crack of branches, but nothing that came close enough to be a real threat. As afternoon faded into evening, Samuel began to wonder if Moses's information had been accurate, if there really was a white man who came here looking for runaways to help, or if that had been a hopeful rumor with no foundation in reality. Night fell, and Samuel huddled in the cave, eating the last of his food and contemplating his next move. He could stay here another day, but without food or a clear plan for moving north, he was just delaying the inevitable. He could try to make his way to the Mississippi River and steal a boat, attempt to float north toward free territory, but that was desperately risky and likely to end in capture or drowning. Or he could wait one more day for Josiah Henderson, betting his life on the hope that a Quaker farmer had both the ability and the willingness to help a runaway slave reach freedom. He was still wrestling with this decision when he heard a voice from outside the cave, quiet but clear. "If there's someone in there, show yourself slowly. I'm not here to hurt you, but I am armed, and I will defend myself if necessary." Samuel's heart leapt. The voice was that of a white man, educated by the accent, but there was something different about it, a gentleness that was unusual in men of his class. "Are you Josiah Henderson?" Samuel called out, not moving from the back of the cave. There was a pause. "I am. And you're running from somewhere, I'm guessing. Otherwise, you wouldn't be in the Devil's Punch Bowl asking for me by name. I'm running from Bellamont, Judge Collier's place. My name is Samuel." "Ah." Another pause. "I've heard the name. There's been talk up and down the trace about a remarkably handsome slave at the Collier estate, causing quite a stir among the ladies. I assume that's you." "Yes, sir." "Well, you picked a hell of a reason to run. Though I suppose it's as good as any other, given that all reasons to flee slavery are good reasons." Henderson's voice moved closer to the cave entrance. "I'm going to come up there so we can talk face to face. Makes conversation easier. Don't do anything stupid and I won't either." Samuel heard the sound of someone climbing the rock face, and then a figure appeared in the cave entrance, silhouetted against the fading light outside. As he moved into the cave, Samuel got his first clear look at Josiah Henderson. He was perhaps 40 years old, of medium height and wiry build, wearing the plain clothes of a farmer, homespun trousers, a rough cotton shirt, a broad-brimmed hat now held in one hand. His face was weathered from outdoor work, but his eyes were kind, and when he looked at Samuel, there was none of the assessment or ownership that white men usually brought to such encounters. "You look like you've been through it," Henderson said, sitting down a respectful distance away. "How long since you left Bellamont?" "Last night. I've been here since before dawn." "They'll be searching hard. Judge Collier has a reputation for not letting his property go without a fight, and I imagine the value he places on you is significant." $800, Samuel said. "He paid $800 for me 3 years ago." Henderson whistled softly. "That's a fortune for a single slave. No wonder he'll want you back." He studied Samuel in the dim light. "So the question is, what do you want from me? If you're looking for help getting north, I can provide it, but you need to understand the risks. The journey is dangerous, and even if you make it to free territory, the Fugitive Slave Act means bounty hunters can pursue you and drag you back. True freedom means Canada, and that's a long way from Mississippi." "I understand the risks," Samuel said. "I'll take dangerous freedom over safe slavery any day." Henderson nodded approvingly. "Good answer. Too many people romanticize what we do, think it's all brave conductors and grateful fugitives singing songs of liberation. The reality is brutal. Most of the people I help are half-starved and terrified. Some get caught before they make it 10 miles. Some die from exposure or accident. Some make it north only to be recaptured. But some make it all the way to Canada and build new lives as free people. That possibility, however slim, is worth fighting for." "How does it work?" Samuel asked. "How would you get me north?" "We move in stages, from one safe house to another. I'll take you to a friend about 20 miles north of here, a freed black man who runs a small farm. You'll rest there for a few days while word is sent ahead to the next station. Then someone will come and take you further north. You'll keep moving like that, a few days at each stop until you reach the Ohio River. Once across, you'll be in free territory, though still not safe. From there, other conductors will help you get to Canada." "How long does it take?" "Months, usually. Sometimes longer if we have to lay low because patrollers are watching. Sometimes faster if we get lucky." Henderson leaned back against the cave wall. "I won't lie to you, Samuel. The odds aren't good. Maybe 1 in 3 runaways makes it all the way to freedom, but those odds are better than staying in Mississippi, where powerful white men have decided you're a threat that needs to be eliminated." Samuel thought about this for a moment. 1 in 3. Those weren't comforting odds, but Henderson was right. They were better than the alternative. "When would we leave?" Samuel asked. "Tonight. Right now, actually. The longer you stay in one place, the more likely you are to be discovered. I have a wagon hidden about a mile from here, concealed under brush near the road. We'll travel at night, stick to back roads, and reach my friend's farm by morning. You'll hide there while I come back and spread some false information about seeing a runaway heading toward Louisiana. That should send the search in the wrong direction and buy us time." Henderson stood up and extended his hand. "So what do you say, Samuel? Are you ready to risk everything for a chance at freedom?" Samuel looked at the offered hand for a long moment. In taking it, he would be trusting his life to a white man he had just met, betting everything on the word of strangers, committing himself to a journey that would likely end in either death or recapture. But the alternative was to return to Bellemont in chains, to face punishment, to be sold away to brutal labor that would kill him slowly, or to be murdered by white men who saw him as a threat to their domestic tranquility. He reached out and clasped Henderson's hand. "I'm ready." Henderson smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. "Then let's go. We have a long walk ahead of us, and I want to be well clear of this area before dawn." They left the cave together, climbing down into the ravine, and then up the other side, Henderson leading the way with the confidence of someone who had made this journey many times before. As they climbed, Samuel looked back once at the Devil's Punch Bowl, that strange, haunted place that had sheltered him when he needed it most. Then he turned his face north and followed Josiah Henderson into the darkness, taking the first steps on a journey that would either end in freedom or in death, but which represented the first real choice he had made in his entire life. Behind them, in the distance, dogs began to bark again. They reached Henderson's wagon an hour before dawn, moving through forest and along the edges of fields, staying far from any roads where patrollers might be watching. The wagon was exactly where Henderson had left it, pulled off into a dense thicket and covered with cut branches and leaves that made it nearly invisible. It was a simple farm wagon, weathered wood and iron, drawn by a single old horse that whickered softly when they approached. "Get in the back," Henderson said quietly, pulling away the camouflage. "There's a false bottom under the regular bed. You'll have to lie flat, and it'll be uncomfortable as hell, but it's the safest way to travel during daylight." Samuel climbed into the wagon and watched as Henderson lifted several boards, revealing a narrow space beneath, perhaps 2 feet high, just barely wide enough for a man to lie down. The space was lined with old blankets to muffle sound and provide minimal cushioning. "How long will I be in there?" Samuel asked, looking at the confined space with apprehension. 4, maybe 5 hours to reach my friend's farm. I know it's not pleasant, but if we encounter patrollers on the road, this is what will save your life. They can search the wagon all they want, and they'll never find you unless they literally tear it apart." Samuel nodded and climbed down into the hidden compartment, lying flat on his back with his arms at his sides. The space was even more cramped than it appeared, and when Henderson lowered the boards back into place and began loading supplies on top, bags of grain, tools, wooden crates, the darkness became absolute, and the weight above created an oppressive sense of being buried alive. Samuel forced himself to breathe slowly, fighting the panic that clawed at his chest. He heard Henderson climb onto the driver's seat, heard the creak of leather and wood as the wagon began to move, felt every bump and rut in the road through the thin boards beneath him. Time became meaningless in the darkness. Samuel couldn't see anything, could barely move, could only lie still and endure. The air in the compartment grew stale and hot as morning came, and sweat soon soaked his clothes. His muscles cramped from being held in one position, but there was no room to shift or stretch. All he could do was breathe and count his heartbeats and try to maintain faith that this suffering would lead somewhere better. Once, the wagon stopped suddenly, and Samuel heard voices. Henderson and another man speaking casually about crops and weather. A patroller, Samuel realized, or perhaps just a neighbor encountered on the road. The conversation seemed to last forever, though it was probably only a few minutes. Samuel held his breath, certain that he could be heard or somehow sensed, but eventually the voices faded and the wagon moved on. Finally, after what felt like days but was probably 4 or 5 hours, as Henderson had estimated, the wagon stopped and Samuel heard the farmer climbing down. Footsteps crunched on gravel, moving around to the back of the wagon, and then the weight of the supplies was removed and light flooded in as the boards were lifted. "We're here," Henderson said, offering his hand to help Samuel climb out. "Welcome to freedom's next station." Samuel emerged, blinking into bright sunlight, his body stiff and aching, his clothes drenched with sweat. They were in a yard behind a small farmhouse, surrounded by forest on 3 sides. The house itself was modest but well maintained, with a vegetable garden to one side and a barn that had seen better days. But the farm's appearance was not what captured Samuel's attention. It was the man standing on the porch watching them with cautious eyes. He was black, perhaps 50 years old, with graying hair and the powerful build of someone who had done hard physical labor all his life. He wore the clothes of a free farmer, simple but not ragged, patched but clean, and he regarded Samuel with an expression that mixed sympathy and wariness. "This is Marcus Freeman," Henderson said, gesturing to the man. "He owns this farm free and clear, paid for with money he earned after purchasing his own freedom 20 years ago. Marcus, this is Samuel, recently of Bellamont." Marcus nodded slowly. "I heard about you. Word travels along the trace. You're the one got all the white ladies in a twist." He didn't smile, but there was something almost approving in his tone. "Took courage to run, especially knowing they'll search hard for you." "Took desperation," Samuel said honestly. "I didn't see another choice. That's usually how it is." Marcus gestured toward the house. "Come inside. You need food and water and rest. Henderson, you want coffee before you head back?" "I do, thanks. Need to be back in Natchez by early afternoon to maintain my routine. Don't want anyone wondering where I was all night." They went inside the farmhouse, which was surprisingly comfortable despite its modest exterior. The main room served as kitchen, dining area, and sitting room, with a stone fireplace at one end and simple furniture arranged throughout. The walls were bare wood, but everything was clean and well kept. A woman appeared from a back room, Marcus's wife, Emma, who looked Samuel over with a critical eye. "He's half-starved," she pronounced. "When's the last time you ate properly?" "Last night in the cave," Samuel admitted. "Before that, yesterday morning at Bellamont." Emma made a disapproving sound and moved to the fireplace, where a pot of something was already simmering. "Sit down. I'll get you real food. Not that dried meat and cornbread they give runaways. You need strength for what's coming." Samuel sat at the wooden table while Emma prepared a meal, and Marcus and Henderson drank coffee and discussed logistics in low voices. Within minutes, Emma placed before him a bowl of thick stew with vegetables and actual chunks of meat, along with fresh bread and butter. Samuel ate slowly, savoring every bite, feeling strength returning to his body with each spoonful. "They'll be searching hard for the next few days," Henderson was saying. "Collier's put out notices, offering a $200 reward for information leading to Samuel's capture. That's enough to motivate every bounty hunter and patroller in Mississippi." "What's the plan?" Marcus asked. "Samuel stays here for at least a week, hidden in the cellar if anyone comes around. I'll head back to Natchez and spread word that I saw a runaway matching his description heading southwest toward Louisiana. That should pull the search away from this area. Meanwhile, we send word north to the next station that we have a package ready to move." "Who's next up the line?" Marcus asked. "Isaiah Whitmore, up near Jackson. He'll take Samuel from there to the Turner farm, and they'll move him to Tennessee. After that," Henderson shrugged, "we can only plan a few steps at a time. Too dangerous to know too much." Samuel listened to them discuss his fate like he was cargo being shipped, which in a sense he was. But there was respect in how they spoke, a recognition of his humanity that was notably absent from similar discussions among the white planters who had owned him. These people were risking everything to help him, and they expected nothing in return except the satisfaction of striking a blow against the institution that had enslaved millions. Henderson finished his coffee and stood. "I need to go. Marcus, you have everything you need. We're good. I'll keep him safe until the next conductor arrives." Henderson turned to Samuel and extended his hand again. "Good luck, Samuel. If all goes well, I'll never see you again, and that'll be the best possible outcome. May God watch over you and guide you to freedom." Samuel shook his hand firmly. "Thank you for everything. I can't repay what you've done." "You don't need to repay it. Just survive, make it to Canada, build a free life. That's payment enough for all of us who do this work." Henderson smiled. "And maybe someday, when you're safe and settled, you can help someone else who's running. That's how this movement works. Each person who makes it to freedom becomes a link in the chain that pulls others out of bondage." Henderson left, and Samuel watched through the window as the wagon rolled away down a narrow dirt road that disappeared into the forest. Then Marcus gestured toward a door at the back of the room. "Let me show you where you'll be staying. We've got a cellar that's not visible from outside. If patrollers come searching, that's where you'll hide. But for now, you can rest upstairs in the spare room. Emma will bring you water for washing, and you can sleep in a real bed for the first time in a while." Samuel followed Marcus up a narrow staircase to a small room under the eaves. It contained a single bed, a chair, and a washstand with a cracked mirror. To Samuel, after years in a slave's quarters at Bellamont, it looked like luxury. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Both of you. You're taking a terrible risk." Marcus's expression softened slightly. 20 years ago, I was where you are now, running, scared, not knowing if I'd live to see the next week. A white couple near Vicksburg hid me in their barn for 2 weeks, while bounty hunters searched the area. They didn't know me, had no reason to help, except that they believed slavery was wrong. When I finally made it to freedom and earned enough money to buy my own land, I swore I'd do the same for others. So this isn't charity, Samuel. This is debt payment, and it's a debt that can never be fully repaid as long as slavery exists. Emma appeared with a basin of water and clean clothes. These belonged to our son before he moved to Ohio. They should fit you well enough. Wash up and rest. You'll need your strength because the journey ahead is long and dangerous." They left him alone, and Samuel washed away days of dirt and sweat, changed into the clean clothes, and lay down on the bed. The mattress felt impossibly soft after nights on the ground and in caves. Within minutes, exhaustion claimed him, and he fell into a deep sleep, unmarred by dreams. He woke to darkness, momentarily disoriented, before remembering where he was. Moonlight filtered through a small window, and he could hear the night sounds of rural Mississippi. Crickets, frogs, the distant hoot of an owl. But there was something else, a sound that didn't belong. Voices, men's voices outside the house. Samuel was instantly alert. He moved to the window and looked out carefully, staying hidden behind the curtain. By moonlight, he could see 3 men on horseback in the yard, patrollers or bounty hunters, armed with rifles and dogs. Marcus stood on the porch talking to them with apparent calm, but Samuel could see the tension in his posture. "I told you, I haven't seen any runaways," Marcus was saying. "I mind my own business, work my own farm. I don't have time to notice who's passing through the area." "You're a free black man," one of the riders said suspiciously. "That makes you sympathetic to runaways. You sure you're not hiding anyone?" "Search if you want," Marcus said, gesturing to the house. "You won't find anything." Samuel's heart pounded. He looked around the small room, but there was nowhere to hide up here. If the men came inside and searched, they would find him. He moved quietly to the door and eased it open, stepping into the hallway. In the darkness, he could make out the shape of the staircase leading down. Below, he heard the front door open. Heavy footsteps on the wooden floor. Emma's voice, sharp with indignation. "You have no right to be in my house without permission." "We have every right," one of the men said. "There's a runaway from Belmont worth $200 in reward money. Judge Collier wants him back bad, and we intend to collect that reward." Samuel moved silently to the staircase and descended step by careful step, keeping close to the wall where the boards were less likely to creak. The voices came from the front room, which meant the men were searching there first. He reached the bottom of the stairs and moved toward the back of the house, where Marcus had indicated the cellar was located. He found the door, just a heavy plank that looked like part of the floor, until you knew to look for the iron ring set into it. Samuel lifted the door as quietly as possible and descended narrow wooden steps into darkness. As soon as he was below floor level, he lowered the door again, plunging himself into absolute blackness. The cellar was small and dank, smelling of earth and root vegetables. Samuel felt his way along rough stone walls until he found what seemed to be a storage area, partially concealed behind stacked crates and barrels. He squeezed into the narrow space and waited. Above him, footsteps moved through the house. He heard the men searching the ground floor, opening doors, moving furniture. Then footsteps on the stairs going up to the second floor. More sounds of searching. A voice calling out, "Nothing up here but an empty bedroom." The footsteps came back down, and Samuel heard the men returning to the main room. Through the floorboards their voices carried clearly. "Satisfied?" Marcus asked, his tone carefully neutral. "For now. But we'll be watching this place. If we find out you helped that runaway, you'll lose everything. Your farm, your freedom, maybe your life. You understand?" "I understand. Now get out of my house." The men left, though Samuel could hear them lingering in the yard for several more minutes, talking among themselves. Finally, the sound of hoofbeats indicated they were riding away. Samuel waited in the darkness of the cellar for what felt like hours before the trap door opened and lamplight flooded in. Marcus's face appeared above, looking down into the cellar. "They're gone. You can come up now." Samuel climbed out of the cellar, his heart still racing. In the lamplight he could see Emma sitting at the table, her face pale but composed. Marcus closed the trap door and sat down heavily. "That was close," Marcus said. "Too close. They'll be back, or others like them will come. The reward is too tempting, and they know free black farmers are likely to help runaways." "Maybe I should leave," Samuel said. "Find somewhere else to hide. I don't want to bring more trouble to you." "You'll stay right here," Emma said firmly. "Those men didn't find you, and if they come back, they won't find you then either. But we need to get you moving north as soon as possible. The longer you stay in Mississippi, the more dangerous it gets." Marcus nodded agreement. "I'll send word tomorrow to Isaiah Whitmore. With luck, he can be here in 2 or 3 days. Until then, you stay in the cellar during daylight hours and only come up at night. It's not comfortable, but it's safe." Samuel spent the next 3 days living like a mole, sleeping in the cellar during the day when unexpected visitors might arrive, emerging only after dark to eat and move around. Emma brought him food and water, and Marcus occasionally came down to talk, sharing stories of his own escape years earlier. "The fear never really leaves you," Marcus said one night, sitting on the cellar steps while Samuel ate dinner by lamplight. "Even now, 20 years free, owning my own land, I still sometimes wake up in a cold sweat, dreaming that patrollers have come to drag me back to slavery. Freedom is supposed to erase that fear, but it doesn't. It just changes it from a constant presence to an occasional visitor." "Was it worth it?" Samuel asked. "All the risk, all the fear, all the years of looking over your shoulder?" Marcus didn't hesitate. Every single day of it was worth it. "Because even bad days in freedom are better than good days in slavery. When I work my fields, I work for myself. When I earn money, I keep it. When I speak as a man, not as property. Those things have value beyond measure, Samuel. Never doubt that." On the 4th night, a knock came at the door just after sunset. 3 quick raps, a pause, then 2 more. Marcus opened the door to reveal a black man in his 30s, dusty from travel, with the wary eyes of someone who had learned to see danger everywhere. Isaiah Whitmore, he introduced himself, shaking Marcus's hand. Heard you have a package that needs moving north. We do, Marcus said, gesturing for Isaiah to enter. Come meet Samuel. Samuel emerged from the cellar to find Isaiah studying him with frank curiosity. So you're the one causing all the commotion. They're searching hard for you. Saw 3 separate groups of patrollers on my way here, all asking about a runaway from Belmont. You must be valuable. $800 valuable, Samuel said. At least that's what Judge Collier paid for me. Isaiah whistled softly. No wonder they want you back. Well, good news is that the harder they search down here, the less they expect you to be heading north. We'll leave tonight. Travel by back roads and forest paths. Stay away from any place patrollers might be watching. With luck, we'll be at my place in 3 days. They prepared to leave as darkness fell completely. Emma packed food for the journey. Cornbread, dried meat, apples, a jar of preserves. Marcus provided a dark coat that would help Samuel blend into the night and a worn hat to shadow his face. Isaiah will keep you safe, Marcus said, clasping Samuel's hand. He's been doing this for 5 years, never lost anyone yet. Trust him, listen to him, and you'll make it through. Thank you, Samuel said to both Marcus and Emma, for everything. Don't thank us, Emma said, tears in her eyes. Just survive. Make it to Canada, live free. That's all the thanks we need. Samuel and Isaiah left the farm on foot, moving north through forests and fields, guided by the North Star and Isaiah's intimate knowledge of the landscape. They walked all night, covering perhaps 15 miles, and hid during the day in the abandoned barn that Isaiah knew was safe. For 3 days, they repeated this pattern, traveling by night, hiding by day, eating sparingly, speaking rarely. Isaiah proved to be excellent company, despite his taciturn nature. He had been born free in Pennsylvania, son of a freed mother and a white father who had acknowledged and supported him. He had come south specifically to work with the Underground Railroad, motivated by a fierce hatred of slavery and a belief that direct action was the only moral response to such evil. Some people think we should work within the system, Isaiah said, as they walked through a moonlit forest on their second night. Convince slaveholders to free their slaves through persuasion and moral argument. But I've seen enough to know that power never surrenders without force. Slaveholders won't give up their profitable system because we ask nicely. They'll only give it up when it becomes more costly to maintain than to abandon. Every slave we help escape makes the system a little less stable, a little less sustainable. On their third night, as they approached Jackson and Isaiah's home, disaster struck. They were moving through a wooded area near a large plantation when they heard dogs barking in the distance. Isaiah immediately grabbed Samuel's arm and pulled him off the path into dense undergrowth. "Slave patrol," he whispered urgently. "They must be out looking for runaways. We need to hide now." They crawled into a hollow beneath a fallen tree, pulling branches and leaves over themselves for concealment. The barking grew louder, along with the sounds of men on horseback crashing through the forest. Torches appeared in the darkness, flickering and dancing as the riders moved through the trees. Samuel's heart hammered in his chest. After all the careful planning, all the successful evasion, were they about to be caught just miles from the next safe station? The patrol passed within 50 feet of their hiding place, close enough that Samuel could hear the men talking to each other, complaining about the difficulty of tracking runaways through thick forest at night. The dogs sniffed and barked, but didn't pinpoint their location, confused perhaps by conflicting scents in the undergrowth. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, the patrol moved on, the sounds of pursuit fading into the distance. Isaiah and Samuel remained hidden for another hour, making certain the danger had truly passed, before cautiously emerging. "That was too close," Isaiah said, brushing leaves from his clothes. "But we're almost there. Just another mile to my place, and then you can rest for a few days while we arrange the next leg of your journey." They reached Isaiah's farm just before dawn, a small property even more modest than Marcus Freeman's, but well hidden in a hollow between hills. Isaiah's wife, Ruth, was waiting anxiously, and she broke into a relieved smile when they appeared. "Thank God," she said, hugging her husband tightly. "I heard the patrol go by hours ago and feared the worst." "We're fine," Isaiah assured her. "This is Samuel. He'll be staying in the hiding place until we can move him north." The hiding place turned out to be a carefully concealed root cellar behind a false wall in the barn. It was cramped and dark, but secure, and Samuel settled into it gratefully, exhausted from 3 nights of constant travel and fear. As he lay in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the farm above him, Samuel realized that he had come perhaps 60 or 70 miles from Belmont. He had survived 10 days on the run, evaded multiple searches, and linked up with 3 different stations of the Underground Railroad. But he had hundreds of miles still to go before reaching true freedom, and every mile would be as dangerous as the ones he had already traveled. He thought about the women whose fascination had triggered his flight: Eleanor Fairchild, Catherine Rutherford, Abigail Morton, and the others. He wondered if they understood the consequences of their obsession, if they knew that their inability to control their desires had nearly cost him his life. He doubted they did, or if they did, that they cared. To them, he had been a fantasy, an object of desire, something beautiful to possess. They had never seen him as a man with his own thoughts and fears and desperate need for freedom. And Judge Collier, Marcus, and all the others still trapped at Belmont. What had happened to them after his escape? Had the judge punished the other enslaved people, trying to force someone to reveal how Samuel had gotten away? Had Isaac been whipped for helping? The guilt of not knowing gnawed at Samuel, but he pushed it away. He could not afford to carry that weight. Survival required moving forward, not looking back. Samuel closed his eyes and forced himself to sleep, dreaming of a place far to the north where he might finally be free. Samuel spent 2 weeks at Isaiah's farm, hidden in the root cellar during the days and allowed to move around the house at night when darkness provided cover. During this time, word came down the chain of conductors that Judge Collier had increased the reward for Samuel's capture to $400, a staggering sum that indicated both the judge's fury and Samuel's value to him. "They want you bad," Isaiah said one evening as they sat in his kitchen after dark. $400 is enough to make honest men consider betrayal. "We need to get you out of Mississippi as quickly as possible, because the longer you stay, the more likely it is that someone will give you up for that reward." The next conductor arrived on a moonless night in early August. A freed black woman named Hannah Price, who operated a secret station near the Tennessee border. She was perhaps 35, strong and confident, with eyes that had seen terrible things but remained unbroken. "I've been doing this for 7 years, she told Samuel as they prepared to leave. "Helped more than 50 people reach freedom. The key to surviving is always assuming danger is near, never relaxing your guard, never trusting your safety to luck. You understand?" "Yes, ma'am," Samuel replied. They traveled together for 5 nights, moving through increasingly hilly terrain as they approached Tennessee. Hannah knew every safe path, every hiding place, every sympathetic farmer who might provide shelter. She carried a pistol beneath her coat, ready to use it if necessary to protect both herself and the people she guided. On the 3rd night, they encountered another group of runaways, a family consisting of a mother, father, and 2 young children, all fleeing from a plantation near Vicksburg. The father had scars on his back from whippings, the mother had burns on her arms from being punished with hot irons, and the children had the haunted eyes of those who had seen violence no child should witness. "We can't all travel together," Hannah said quietly to Samuel after assessing the family. "Too many people make us more visible, easier to spot. But I can't leave them either. So here's what we'll do. You'll travel with the father while I take the mother and children by a different route. We'll meet up at the next station in 3 days." Samuel found himself partnered with a man named Joshua, who was perhaps 40 years old and moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose body had been broken and painfully healed multiple times. They traveled mostly in silence, two men united by circumstance and the common goal of freedom. On their second night together, as they rested in a cave near the Tennessee border, Joshua spoke for the first time about what had driven him to run. "Overseer raped my wife," he said quietly, staring into the darkness. "Did it in front of me, made me watch while he violated her, then beat me half to death when I tried to intervene. Master didn't care, said it was the overseer's right to discipline slaves however he saw fit. That night, while I was healing from the beating, I told my wife we were leaving. She wanted to stay, said running was too dangerous with children, but I told her dying was more dangerous. Better to risk death for freedom than accept living death in slavery." Samuel had no words adequate to respond to such horror. He simply sat with Joshua in the darkness, offering silent companionship to a man whose suffering had driven him to desperate action. They reached Hannah's next station on schedule, a farm owned by a white couple named the Hendersons, relatives of Josiah Henderson, who shared his Quaker beliefs and commitment to helping runaways. The farm sat just across the Tennessee border, technically in free territory, but still extremely dangerous because bounty hunters regularly crossed state lines in pursuit of fugitives. Hannah arrived the next day with Joshua's family, and they all rested for 3 days while arrangements were made for the next leg of the journey. During this time, Samuel learned more about the complex network of the Underground Railroad, the coded signals conductors used to communicate, the safe houses scattered across the South and North, the elaborate precautions taken to protect both fugitives and those who helped them. "It's a war," Mrs. Henderson told Samuel one evening as she treated blisters on his feet. "A secret war fought in shadows, with different weapons than conventional conflict, but no less deadly. Every escaped slave is a victory against the slaveholders. Every successful journey north is a battle won. And someday, when enough battles have been won, the war itself will end and slavery will collapse." Samuel wanted to believe her, but having lived his entire life under the system's brutal weight, he found it hard to imagine a future without slavery. It seemed eternal, unchangeable, as much a part of America as the Constitution or the Mississippi River. From the Henderson farm, Samuel and Joshua's family were passed to another conductor, then another, moving steadily north through Tennessee and into Kentucky. The journey became a blur of nighttime travel and daytime hiding, of kind strangers who risked everything to help and hostile locals who would gladly collect reward money by turning them in. In Kentucky, they encountered their closest call yet. A bounty hunter had been tracking them, somehow picking up their trail despite all precautions. He caught up to them at a farmhouse where they had stopped for food, and a confrontation ensued that ended with the conductor, a freed black man named Abraham, shooting the bounty hunter in self-defense. "He's not dead," Abraham said, checking the wounded man. "But we need to leave immediately. When he recovers enough to talk, he'll bring authorities and they'll arrest everyone here. Go now." Indeed, they fled into the night, moving faster than was safe, crashing through undergrowth and across streams, pursued by the knowledge that their presence had brought violence and danger to someone who had been trying to help them. The guilt weighed heavily on Samuel, but Abraham's final words stayed with him. "This is the price of freedom. Sometimes it's paid in blood." As they crossed into Ohio in late September, Samuel finally felt something change inside him. He was in free territory now. Technically, legally, he was no longer a slave, but the Fugitive Slave Act meant the designation was largely meaningless. Bounty hunters could still pursue him, capture him, drag him back to Mississippi in chains. True freedom lay further north, across the border into Canada. They moved through Ohio quickly, passed from station to station with increasing urgency. Word had reached them that Judge Collier had hired professional slave catchers who were tracking Samuel's route north, staying just days behind. The race was on. Would Samuel reach Canada before the hunters caught up with him? In Cleveland, they found passage on a ship crossing Lake Erie to Canada. The captain was a white man with abolitionist sympathies who regularly smuggled fugitive slaves across the border, charging nothing for his services and risking arrest every time he made the journey. "You're the last passenger this season," he told Samuel and Joshua's family as they boarded late one night in October. "Winter's coming early, and the lake will be too dangerous to cross much longer. You're lucky you made it when you did." The crossing took most of a night, the ship cutting through dark waters under a sky full of stars. Samuel stood at the rail, wrapped in a blanket against the cold, watching America recede behind him. Somewhere back there was Mississippi, Bellamont, Judge Collier, and the women whose fascination had set all of this in motion. Somewhere back there was a life he had lived for 24 years, a life of bondage and beauty wielded like a weapon against him. But ahead lay Canada, freedom, and the possibility of a future he chose for himself. As dawn broke, land appeared on the horizon, the Canadian shore, the promised land that millions of enslaved people dreamed of, but few ever reached. The ship approached the dock in a small town called Windsor, and when it finally stopped and the gangplank was lowered, Samuel took his first steps onto free soil as a free man. Joshua's family embraced each other, crying and laughing simultaneously. Other passengers, fugitives who had made similar journeys, shook Samuel's hand and welcomed him to freedom. The ship's captain smiled and wished them all well, then prepared to return to Cleveland for his next cargo of human hope. Samuel stood on the dock, feeling the solid ground beneath his feet, breathing air that somehow seemed different now that he breathed it as a free man. He thought about all the people who had helped him reach this moment: Isaac, Moses Tucker, Josiah Henderson, Marcus and Emma Freeman, Isaiah and Ruth Whitmore, Hannah Price, and dozens of others whose names he never learned, but whose courage and kindness had saved his life. A representative from a local settlement of freed slaves approached them, offering assistance in finding housing and work. "Welcome to Canada," he said warmly. "You're safe here. The slave catchers can't touch you. You're truly free." Samuel had heard those words before, but now, standing on Canadian soil with the United States behind him and a new life ahead, he finally believed them.